My sister called at 4 a.m. The man you're dating, I've seen him before, in the news. There are moments in your life that split time in two, before and after. The kind of moment that rewires your understanding of every single thing that came before it, that makes you look back at a whole year of your life and realize you were reading a story in a language you didn't actually speak. I know what that feels like. I know the exact texture of that moment. The cold bathroom tile under bare feet, the fluorescent light too bright for 4 a.m., the sensation of the floor dropping away beneath you while you're standing perfectly still. My name is Emma, and this is the story of the 4 a.m. phone call that destroyed everything I thought I had and gave me back everything I actually was. But before I tell you about the call, I need you to understand what I was before it. Because the setup matters. The height of the fall determines everything about how hard you land. I was 28 years old, living in Silver Lake, Los Angeles. That particular kind of neighborhood that feels like the whole city compressed into a few square miles. Coffee shops where people argue about architecture and screenplays, murals on the sides of buildings that someone actually thought about. The reservoir in the morning light. I'd moved to LA at 23 with a design degree from Cal Poly and the specific, terrifying confidence of someone who hasn't yet been truly disappointed. I wanted to design buildings. Not just any buildings, the kind that changed how neighborhoods felt. Community centers with real light. Libraries that made people want to stay. Housing that treated its residents like they deserved beauty, not just shelter. For 5 years, I'd been doing the work. Starting at a mid-size architecture firm downtown, learning the bureaucratic machinery of permits and city codes and client management, saving every dollar I could, building toward the moment I'd strike out on my own. I had a plan. I'd always had a plan. My friends called me the most organized person they knew, which was sometimes a compliment and sometimes a gentle criticism, a way of saying that I lived more in my head than in the moment. And then Marcus walked into my life at a gallery opening in Echo Park, and for the first time in years, I stopped planning and just felt. He was charming in a way that seemed effortless, but wasn't. I could see the craft in it, the attentiveness, and I mistook that craft for depth. He asked me about my work and actually listened. When I started talking about sight lines and natural light and how the placement of a window could change the emotional temperature of a room, he didn't glaze over the way some people did. He leaned in. He asked follow-up questions. He laughed at the right moments. By the end of the night, I'd told him more about my ambitions than I'd told most people I'd known for years. He was in financial consulting, he said. Worked with small businesses on growth strategy. Thoughtful, careful, good with numbers. He had an easy laugh and a quiet confidence that felt like steadiness, like someone who'd figured out what mattered and let the rest fall away. He asked for my number before the gallery closed. And when he texted the next morning, not that afternoon, not 2 days later in the calculated way that some people manage their vulnerability, but the next morning, 9:15, while I was at my drafting table, the message was a photograph. He'd gone back to the same gallery and taken a picture of a painting we'd stood in front of the night before, a large abstract piece in oceanic blues and greens that I'd said reminded me of the light quality I was chasing for a project. No caption, just the photo. I looked at it for a moment and understood that he'd been listening more carefully than most people did, carefully enough to remember a specific thing I'd said and reflect it back to me the next day. I texted back a single word: perfect. We had dinner 3 days later. Our first date was at a small Japanese restaurant in Los Feliz. His suggestion, and a good one, because he'd asked me once in passing what my comfort food was, and I'd mentioned my mother's cooking and the word warmth, and somehow he'd triangulated from that to a quiet place with wood-paneled walls and soft lighting and a chef's tasting menu that felt intimate without being performative. I noticed later that everything about him in those early months had that quality. Seemingly instinctive, actually precise. He was reading me the way an architect reads a site before designing for it. He walked the perimeter, he noted the angles, and then he built something that fit. We talked for 3 hours that first dinner, about the difference between buildings that age gracefully and buildings that decay, which he turned into an analogy for businesses I could see he'd actually thought through. About growing up, he'd moved around a lot as a kid, he said, which explained a certain quality of self-containment, a practiced ease in new environments. About the way cities carry memory in their street patterns, their old neighborhood boundaries, the names of streets that no longer make sense because the original reason for them has been gone for decades. He was smart. He was curious. He made me feel, across a small table in Los Feliz, like the person he most wanted to be talking to in the world. I drove home at midnight with the windows down and the warm Los Angeles air moving through the car, and I felt, for the first time in years, like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The first 3 months were, I think, the most carefully constructed. He was present without being overwhelming. He didn't crowd me, didn't demand my time in ways that felt controlling, didn't make me feel like I was being absorbed. He had his own life, his own schedule, his own projects he talked about with the specific energy of someone who cared about their work. He came to an open house for a community project I'd designed and stood at the back with his hands in his pockets, watching the neighborhood families walk through the space. And when they left, he said, "You made them feel welcome. You can see it in how they move through the room." I remember the way that landed, the feeling of being understood by someone who understood what I was trying to do. I fell for all of it. Because I wasn't naive, I want you to understand that. I was a sharp, capable woman who had built a competent professional life from scratch in a city that didn't make anything easy. I'd navigated difficult clients and competitive workplaces and the specific loneliness of ambition. I was not a person who missed things. And that is exactly why what happened to me is so important to understand. He didn't target naive women. He targeted capable, ambitious, trusting women. Women who believed they were good judges of character. Women who, when they gave their trust, gave it completely, because they weren't in the habit of giving it carelessly. "You're so trusting," he told me once, about 4 months in, kissing my forehead after I'd told him about a client who'd taken advantage of my good faith on a payment schedule. "It's one of the things I love about you." I remember exactly how those words felt, landing. Warm, seen. Like he appreciated a quality in me that I sometimes worried was a weakness. I tucked the phrase away in the small collection of things he'd said that made me feel understood. I did not recognize it as the sound of a predator assessing the perimeter. We moved fast, or rather, things moved fast around us in a way that seemed organic at the time. By month 6, he had a key to my Silver Lake apartment. By month 9, we were talking about the future with the casual confidence of people who've decided they've found something real. By month 12, we signed a lease on a bigger apartment in West Hollywood together, a beautiful second-floor unit with high ceilings and those long windows that let in the particular golden light of late afternoon. I remember standing in the empty apartment the day we signed, looking at the light on the hardwood floors, thinking, this is it. This is the beginning. The West Hollywood apartment settled into a domestic rhythm that felt, from the inside, like exactly what a shared life should feel like. We cooked on Sunday evenings. Marcus made a surprisingly good shakshuka, and I made dumplings the way my mother had taught me. And we'd eat at the kitchen counter with a bottle of wine and the windows open and the distant noise of the city coming in on the breeze. He was considerate about small things. He remembered how I took my coffee. He noticed when I was stressed before I said anything. He had a habit of leaving a glass of water on my nightstand before bed because he knew I always woke up thirsty at 2 a.m. These are the things that work on you over time. Not the grand gestures, but the accumulated weight of small attentiveness that reads cumulatively as love. What I didn't see then, what I can see now with the particular clarity of hindsight, is how much of myself I was gradually adjusting in those months. The friends I saw less often because Marcus preferred evenings at home. The design projects I let sit on the back burner because our conversations about our shared future occupied more and more of my thinking time. The slow way my world was contracting around him, not in any dramatic way that would have registered as a warning, but in the ordinary, incremental way of someone who has decided they've found the person they want and has started orienting everything else around that center. Tanya would say later that she noticed it around month 8. "You stopped being you," she told me carefully, much later. "You started being us." At the time, I would have heard that as a compliment, as evidence that I'd found something real enough to invest in fully. What she was actually describing was a woman disappearing, gradually and willingly, into someone else's version of who she should be. But I didn't know that then. Then, it felt like love. I'd been planning to launch my own firm. I'd been saving for it, strategizing for it, designing the whole structure of it in my head for years. And 2 months before the lease signing, my grandmother had passed, leaving me an inheritance of $340 dollars. It was her life savings, a woman who'd worked 40 years and spent almost nothing on herself, who'd believed her granddaughter would do something worth doing with it. I'd opened a dedicated business account and transferred the full amount. It was supposed to be the launch pad, the thing that let me stop waiting and actually begin. Marcus had suggested I add him as a joint account holder. "For emergencies," he said. "Just practical, right? You never know what could happen." He'd been so casual about it, so reasonable. It was practical. We were building a life together. Of course it made sense. Of course. And so, on a Sunday evening in early October, Emma Chen, who had spent 5 years planning every move carefully, who had built her professional life brick by brick, who had earned her grandmother's faith, had a boyfriend with a key to her apartment, his name on her lease, and access to every cent she had in the world. She had no idea what any of that actually meant. The Tuesday night she would remember as her last night of that particular innocence. Emma went to bed at 10:30. She had an early client call. She was tired. Marcus was beside her, warm and present, his arm draped across her waist. She remembers thinking, right before she fell asleep, that she was lucky. They'd had a quiet evening. Nothing remarkable, the kind of ordinary Tuesday that doesn't announce itself. She'd come home from the office around 7 with takeout from the Thai place 2 blocks east, the one with the slow elevator and the owner who always remembered their usual order. Marcus had been at the kitchen table with his laptop, scrolling through something, and he'd closed it when she came in. Not guiltily, just with the comfortable efficiency of someone setting work aside for the evening. They'd eaten on the couch, watching a documentary about the restoration of old European cathedrals, which Emma had chosen because she never got tired of watching other people care deeply about buildings. Marcus had fallen asleep halfway through, his head dropping toward her shoulder in the way he did when he was genuinely relaxed, and she'd let it rest there and watch the cathedral restoration alone with a kind of quiet contentment. She'd thought, sometime in that quiet hour, "We're good. We've built something good." She would replay that thought for months. She would examine it from every angle, looking for the naivety in it, for the signal she'd missed, the flaw in the foundation she'd been standing on. She would eventually understand that the thought hadn't been wrong exactly. They had built something. But what had been built was not what she'd thought. She'd been building a life. He'd been building a trap. She would turn 29 in 6 weeks. She had $338,920 in her business account, a beautiful apartment, a man she loved, and a future that finally felt close enough to touch. She did not know that a clock was already running out. At 4:17 in the morning, Emma's phone lit up on the nightstand. Her sister's name, Rachel. Rachel never called at 4 a.m. Rachel was 26, responsible, a school teacher in Pasadena who went to bed by 10 and woke at 6. If Rachel was calling at 4:17 a.m., something was wrong. Emma grabbed the phone with the particular efficiency of someone yanked from sleep by alarm, and she moved on instinct, carrying it to the bathroom so the ringing wouldn't wake Marcus, easing the door mostly closed behind her. "Rachel, what's wrong?" The fluorescent light buzzed. Emma's reflection in the mirror looked pale, her dark hair loose, her expression caught between sleep and fear. The man you're dating. Rachel's voice was tight, compressed, like she'd been holding it in and couldn't anymore. I've seen him before, in the news. You know that feeling when the floor disappears beneath you? Not metaphorically. I mean the literal physical sensation of the ground becoming unreliable, your body's certainty suddenly unsure. Emma gripped the edge of the bathroom counter with one hand without knowing she'd done it, her knuckles going white against the white porcelain. Through the crack in the bathroom door, she could see a sliver of the bedroom, the dark shape of Marcus sleeping peacefully, one arm stretched out across her side of the bed, his chest rising and falling with the easy rhythm of someone who had nothing to hide. What are you talking about? His face, Em. I couldn't sleep, so I was scrolling, and there was this article that kept getting recommended. It was from 2019, some business news site, a fraud case in San Diego, corporate embezzlement. They posted a photo of the defendant. Rachel's voice cracked. It's Marcus. Same face. I swear to God it's the same face, just a different name. Send me the link, Emma said. Her voice was very quiet, very controlled, in the way that means the opposite of calm. The link arrived 30 seconds later. Emma stared at the notification for a moment before she opened it. Because some part of her, the part that still believed in the world she'd understood before this phone call, wanted to delay. She opened it anyway. The article was from the San Diego Union Tribune. The date, November 12, 2019. The headline, Former CFO convicted in $847,000 embezzlement scheme. And there, beneath the headline, a photograph. A man in a gray suit. Caught mid-stride outside a courthouse, his face turned slightly toward the camera. Younger looking, leaner in the jaw, sharper around the eyes because he hadn't yet softened into whatever persona he'd constructed since. But the face was the same. The cheekbones were the same. The set of the mouth was the same. Emma had kissed that mouth 1,000 times, and she knew every angle of it, and there was no version of reality in which this was a coincidence. The article called him Michael Brennan, former CFO of a medical device company called Meridian Health Systems. Convicted of systematically siphoning $847 worth from investors over a 3-year period, redirecting funds through a web of shell accounts while maintaining the appearance of a legitimate, growing company. Sentenced to 6 years. The article included a line about his attorney arguing for leniency, first offense, remorse, cooperation with investigators. Sentenced to 6 years, eligible for parole after 4. Emma's mind was running the math before she was conscious of it. 6 years. Sentenced in late 2019. Released after 4 for good behavior. That would mean he was out in late 2023. He'd moved to Los Angeles in January 2024. He'd told her that when they met, told her he'd recently relocated, still feeling out the city, which was part of why he seemed so present when she'd talked about neighborhoods she loved. He'd asked her questions about the city with the curiosity of someone still discovering it. He'd been out of prison for approximately 3 months when he met her. She stood in her bathroom at 4:23 a.m., holding a phone with a news article about a convicted fraudster who was currently asleep in her bed, and she thought about the lease. She thought about the business account. She thought about the specific way he'd said, for emergencies, when he suggested she add him as a joint holder. She opened the banking app. Business account. She navigated to it with hands that had gone ice cold, and the number that appeared where $338,920 should have been was $1,247. $1,247. Yesterday morning, she'd checked the balance and it had been full. She had not made any transactions. There was only one other person who could have. Emma set the phone down on the bathroom counter and looked at herself in the mirror for a long moment. She was aware of extraordinary stillness. The kind of stillness that comes after the detonation, when the sound has passed and you're still standing and you don't yet know what's been taken from you. Her reflection looked back, dark eyes wide, face white, hair loose around her shoulders. Behind her, visible through the crack in the door, Marcus's arm shifted slightly in his sleep. His hand opened and closed on nothing, on empty air where she'd been lying. "I trusted you with everything," she thought, "and I don't even know who you are." The wave of that thought broke over her slowly, not all at once. It moved through her in layers. First, the immediate, factual reality. The money was gone. The account was stripped. Then the second layer, 14 months. 14 months of specific patient work. The gallery opening, the first date in Los Feliz, the shakshuka on Sunday evenings, the glass of water on the nightstand, the photograph of the painting texted at 9:15 the morning after they'd met. All of it constructed, not one spontaneous, generous impulse. All of it deliberate, all of it assembled with the precision of someone who knew exactly what he was building and why. The attentiveness that she'd read as love was a professional technique. The care that had felt like being seen was a method of gaining access. She went back through the specific memories the way you go through a house after a break-in, looking at each room, assessing what was taken, what was staged, what had always been missing. The night he'd asked about the business account, how casually he'd mentioned it, as though the thought had just occurred to him over dinner, as though he hadn't been waiting for exactly the right moment when she was relaxed and trusting and would hear it as a natural next step. The lease. His name listed first, and she'd noticed it briefly, signed anyway, because they were building a future together. The way he'd been able to name, precisely, the qualities she most valued in herself, her trust, her ambition, her care, because he needed her to believe he saw her clearly, needed her to feel that, to hand him everything without looking too hard at his hands. She did not cry. She did not scream. She pulled up the lease document on her phone, scrolling to the signatory page she'd barely glanced at when they'd signed. Primary leaseholder, Marcus Chen. Co-leaseholder, Emma Chen. She knew California tenant law well enough. She'd designed enough residential projects to understand how landlord-tenant agreements worked. Tenant priority defaulted to the primary leaseholder in disputes. He could cite abandonment if she left. He could lock her out legally, and she'd have almost no recourse. He hadn't just taken her money. He'd positioned himself to take the apartment too. She'd handed him every lever he needed, all the tools to leave her with nothing. And she'd done it willingly, trustingly, because she'd believed she was building a future with a man who loved her. She went back into the bedroom. She dressed in the dark, moving silently, because something in her knew with absolute certainty that she could not be in this room when he woke up. She pulled 2 suitcases from the closet with the careful movements of someone diffusing something. She packed what was hers, her portfolio, her laptop, her camera, her grandmother's pearl earrings, her design books, 2 weeks of clothes. She did not take anything that was shared. She did not leave a note. She carried the suitcases to the front door, stood for a moment looking back at the bedroom, at the man sleeping peacefully, who had looked at her and seen a resource to be extracted. And then she walked out. She paused on the landing outside the apartment door, suitcases at her feet, in the particular hush of a building at 4:40 in the morning. The hallway smelled like the lavender candles that a neighbor always burned and the faint ghost of last night's cooking from somewhere farther down the hall. Ordinary smells. The smells of other people's ordinary lives, proceeding without rupture. For one moment, Emma stood in the middle of all that ordinary quiet and felt the full weight of the distance between what she'd believed this life was and what it had actually been. The hallway light flickered once, a tiny orange pulse in the fluorescent tube above her, and then steadied. She picked up her suitcases. She walked down the stairs. The West Hollywood street at 5 a.m. was quiet, the particular silvery hush of early morning in Los Angeles, before the city wakes and the noise begins. Emma sat on her suitcases on the sidewalk outside the building where she'd lived for 2 months and called her friend Tanya, who answered on the 3rd ring with the groggy patience of someone who knows what it means when a friend calls before sunrise. "I need somewhere to stay," Emma said. "I'll explain everything. I just need... Can I come over?" "I'm already unlocking the door," Tanya said. She never went back for anything. Marcus texted her at 7:23 a.m. Where are you? We need to talk. She stared at the message on Tanya's couch in Koreatown, surrounded by the ordinary domestic warmth of someone else's apartment, a half-dead succulent on the windowsill, running shoes by the door, the smell of coffee from the kitchen. And she tried to reconcile the man who'd sent that message with the person she'd actually been sleeping beside. She could not. There was no through line. She'd been intimate with a performance, a role constructed specifically to extract everything useful from her before discarding the shell. She didn't respond. At 9:45 a.m. he called. She blocked the number. At 2:30 p.m., she received a formal email from an attorney representing Marcus Chen, not Michael Brennan. He was still hiding inside the stolen name, informing her that she had abandoned the lease property in violation of her agreement, and that her security deposit of $4,800 would be forfeited. The email was clipped, professional, weaponized. He'd had this ready. The attorney hadn't been retained this morning. The email was too precise, too prepared. He'd had legal cover standing by, anticipating exactly this sequence of events. The moment she discovered the truth and ran, the legal machinery was already in motion to make sure she couldn't recover even the smallest thing. Emma read the email twice and felt something she didn't have a name for yet. Not anger, not sadness, but something colder and harder than either. The particular feeling of understanding the full architecture of what had been done to you. Tanya sat beside her on the couch. "What do you need right now?" "I don't know," Emma said honestly. "I think I'm still figuring out what just happened." The fog settled in over the next 6 days. If I'm being honest with you, those 6 days were the darkest of the story, darker in some ways than the 4 a.m. discovery, because at 4 a.m. at least she was moving. The fog was different. The fog was stillness, paralysis, the loop of a mind turned against itself. Emma lay on Tanya's couch and watched the ceiling and couldn't eat with any real hunger and couldn't sleep with any real depth and couldn't think her way out of the question that kept circling back, always the same question. How did I not see it? Day 2, she lay on the couch until noon and then sat up and tried to make a list, a practical to-do list, the kind that had always been her way of managing overwhelming problems. She wrote 3 items and then sat looking at them and couldn't figure out what any of them actually meant or required, because all of it led back to the same place. He'd done this, and she hadn't known, and the knowing had come too late. She put the list away and lay back down. Day 3, she called her bank and spent 47 minutes on hold, and then another 30 minutes speaking to a fraud specialist who was professionally kind, but explained, with the careful precision of someone accustomed to delivering bad news, that a transfer made by an authorized joint account holder did not meet the legal definition of unauthorized access. Her access had been authorized. That was the mechanism. That was how it worked. She thanked the specialist and hung up and sat in Tanya's bathroom with the fan running so Tanya wouldn't hear her, and cried for the first time since the morning she'd left, the specific, ugly crying of someone who has held it together past the point where holding it together is useful and is now paying the price for that delay. Day 4, Rachel drove down from Pasadena with soup and a specific look on her face. Not pity, which Emma couldn't have tolerated, but the focused, intent look of a person who had arrived to help and would not be deterred. She sat on the opposite end of the couch and didn't push Emma to talk, just sat there, present in the way that doesn't ask for anything in return. Emma found herself, eventually, talking, not about the money or the legal situation, but about specific memories. The painting photograph at 9:15, the shakshuka on Sunday evenings, the documentary about cathedrals. How ordinary it had all been, how it had felt like nothing except what it was supposed to be. She wasn't looking for Rachel to explain it. She just needed someone to hold the memories while she looked at them, so she wasn't alone in the room with them. She was intelligent, she was observant. She'd given up a good job, trusted a man with her grandmother's savings, added his name to her lease, believed every word he'd said to her about gentleness and attentiveness and love. She'd made herself vulnerable in all the ways that vulnerability requires, and she'd been precise and accurate and wrong. And somewhere underneath the grief was the specific shame of someone who prided themselves on their judgment, realizing that their judgment had failed them catastrophically. How could I be so stupid? She knows now that the question was the wrong question. She knows that the answer to how did I miss it is not stupidity or naivety or any failure of her own. It's that she encountered a professional, a man who had done this before, who had refined his technique through practice, who specifically sought out women with the characteristics he needed: intelligence, ambition, emotional generosity, trust. He hadn't accidentally fallen for her. He'd selected her. She was exactly the mark he was looking for. But she didn't know that yet on day 2 and day 3 and day 4. She just knew the loop. How did I not see it? How could I be so stupid? I gave him everything. I don't have anything left. Rachel called every day. Tanya brought her food and sat with her and didn't force conversation, just maintained the quiet pressure of presence that's sometimes the only thing that keeps a person from dissolving entirely. Emma is still grateful for that, for the people who showed up in the fog and stayed, who didn't demand that she process faster or present better or already be okay. On the 7th day, Tanya came home from work and sat down across from Emma and said, gently but firmly, "We're going to see an attorney tomorrow. I already found someone. I made the appointment. You don't have to do anything except get dressed and come with me." And Emma, who didn't have the energy to argue and maybe didn't want to, said, "Okay." The attorney's name was Lisa Okonkwo, and her office was in Century City. A small suite on the 14th floor with a view of the West Side and framed law school diplomas on the wall, and a desk organized with the specific precision of someone who handles chaos for a living. She was in her early 40s. With close-cropped hair and reading glasses, she kept pushing up her nose and the manner of someone who had heard a lot of terrible things and maintained her equilibrium specifically because she had learned what could be done about them. Emma sat across from Lisa and recited the facts in the flat, dissociated voice of someone who hasn't yet fully claimed ownership of their own story. The 4 a.m. call. The news article, Michael Brennan, convicted of embezzling $847,000, sentenced to 6 years, released after 4. The new name. The 14 months of relationship. The West Hollywood apartment. The lease with his name first. The business account with her grandmother's $340, the transfer that had left her with $1,247, the attorney's email about the security deposit. Lisa listened. She took notes in a precise, small hand. She asked follow-up questions, dates, amounts, document names, and Emma answered them all, grateful for the structure, for the fact that Lisa was treating this as something that had a logical shape, that could be mapped and addressed. When Emma finished, Lisa set her pen down and looked up with sharp, focused eyes. "You said he used the name Marcus Chen on your lease and bank accounts?" "Yes." But his legal name after his release would still be Michael Brennan, unless he went through a formal name change process, which would be documented. That means every document he signed as Marcus Chen is potentially fraudulent. The lease could be void. The account transfers could be criminal. Lisa paused. "And you, Emma, have legal standing to file for emergency asset recovery." Emma blinked. The words arrived with the particular quality of something that doesn't match the reality you'd constructed. "I do? California has strong protections for victims of financial abuse and fraud. We can file a motion to freeze the accounts where your money was transferred if we move quickly, before he moves the funds again. We can pursue criminal charges for identity fraud, theft, and financial abuse. The lease situation is complex, but it's not hopeless. A lease signed under a fraudulent name has significant vulnerabilities." "I thought I'd lost everything," Emma said quietly. "I've spent a week thinking there was nothing I could do." "I understand why it felt that way. The legal system is imperfect and it's slow, and people who do what he did are counting on their victims feeling exactly that helplessness." Lisa's voice was precise, unapologetic. "But the system also exists for exactly this situation. You have rights, And you have documentation, the original article, the bank statements, the lease documents, the account access records. You have a case. Emma looked at her. What do I need to do? Lisa held her gaze. Fight. But you won't be fighting alone. Something happened in Emma's chest in that moment. Something small and fragile, like the first breath after being underwater. It wasn't confidence yet. It wasn't hope exactly. It was something more foundational than either. The understanding that she had not been rendered powerless. She had options. She had rights. The law could be a weapon in her hands, not just in his. She sat up slightly straighter in the chair. The legal machinery, once set in motion, moved the way legal machinery always moves, slowly, exhaustingly, with the bureaucratic weight of forms and filings and waiting and more waiting. Lisa filed the emergency motion to freeze the account where the funds had been transferred. It took 72 hours to be heard. The court granted it. Emma's $338,920 was frozen. Marcus couldn't spend it, couldn't move it, couldn't use it. He was holding her money, but he couldn't access it, and that knowledge was the first thing that felt like progress. The LAPD opened an investigation into identity fraud. Emma provided everything: the 2019 news article, the bank statements, the lease documents, the timeline of their relationship, the messages leading up to him being added as a joint account holder. An investigator named Sergeant Alvarez called her twice with follow-up questions, treating her with a careful, professional respect that she hadn't expected and was more grateful for than she'd anticipated. Sergeant Alvarez was thorough in a way she found steadying. He did not express surprise or skepticism. He asked her questions about timeline, about specific dates, about the sequence in which Marcus had requested different kinds of access, and the questions themselves were a revelation. She could hear in them the architecture of what Marcus had done, the careful progression of access requests that had been spaced out exactly far enough apart that each one felt like a natural next step rather than a deliberate escalation. Alvarez had seen this structure before. He was putting her story alongside other stories he'd collected and finding the shape. That was its own kind of horror, to understand that her specific experience was a method, a repeatable process, but it was also clarifying. It placed her suffering in a category that had a name and a legal address. "He's done this before," she said to Alvarez on their second call, not as a question. "We're looking into it," he said carefully, which was not an answer but was answer enough. She waited. She filed. She answered questions and provided documentation and called Lisa every few days for updates that were incremental and often frustrating in their smallness. But each small step was a step, and the accumulation of steps was movement. And movement, after the paralysis of those first 6 days, felt like the most important thing in the world. And in the midst of all of it, the filings, the waiting, the calls from Lisa with incremental updates, something unexpected started happening. Emma started remembering herself. She'd been on Tanya's couch for almost 3 weeks when she found herself at midnight, reaching for the design notebook she'd packed in her first suitcase because it had lived on the nightstand and she'd grabbed it automatically. She opened it. The last pages were covered in sketches she'd made months ago, before she'd gotten so consumed by building the shared future with Marcus that she'd stopped making time for her own thinking. She looked at the sketches, facades, sightlines, a community space she'd been daydreaming about for a neighborhood she loved, and she thought, these are good. She drew for 2 hours. She didn't sleep until almost 3. When she finally set the notebook down and lay back on Tanya's couch, something felt different, slightly reoriented, like a compass needle that had been pulled off north by a magnet slowly finding its way back. Over the next week, she pulled up the design files on her laptop, projects she'd shelved, ideas she'd half-developed and abandoned because Marcus had needed her attention, her time, her energy. She'd been so focused on building the future they'd discussed, his vision of their future, she understood now, which had required making herself smaller, adjusting her priorities to accommodate his needs and his preferences and his timeline, that she'd stopped doing the work that was actually hers. She spread printouts across Tanya's living room floor one evening, and Tanya came home and picked her way carefully between them and stood there looking at Emma in the middle of it all and said something Emma has carried with her ever since. "You're coming back," Tanya said. "The real you. I missed her." Emma looked up, surprised. "You missed her?" "Yeah." Tanya sat down on the edge of the couch. "You've been dim for over a year, Em, like someone turned the voltage down. Now you're bright again." Bright. Emma turned the word over. She hadn't thought of herself as bright or dim. She'd thought of herself as happy, content, building something. But Tanya had watched from the outside, and Tanya was telling her that what Emma had mistaken for contentment had actually looked like dimming, like someone adjusting their wattage to fit a space that couldn't hold their full light. She thought about, "You're so trusting," and the warmth she'd felt hearing it, the way she'd accepted it as love, as appreciation. She thought about what it must have actually meant from inside his calculation. Here is someone who will not question me, who will believe me, who will hand me what I need with both hands. She'd heard affection. He'd been marking a vulnerability for use. That thought, the gap between what she'd heard and what had been meant, didn't break her the way it might have 2 weeks earlier. It clarified something. It drew a clean line between who she'd been performing to be for him and who she actually was. And the person she actually was, spread out across Tanya's living room floor, surrounded by her own work, was someone she recognized and respected. The network came next, and it came through Tanya. Her friend had done something practical and generous in the background of Emma's worst weeks. She'd reached out to women she knew who had survived similar things: financial fraud, business destruction, the systematic dismantling of a life by someone trusted to help build it. She'd arranged, very casually, for Emma to meet some of them. There was Jenna, who'd opened a bakery in Silver Lake after her ex-husband had destroyed her credit and drained their joint accounts. She had flour perpetually under her fingernails and the manner of someone who'd decided that the best response to devastation was to make things that were genuinely good. She taught Emma, practically and specifically, how to rebuild credit from the ground up. Not advice, but mechanics, numbers, steps. There was Priya, a consulting firm owner who'd been blacklisted in her industry after a vindictive former employer had spread strategic lies about her professional conduct. She'd rebuilt by going around the industry instead of through it, finding clients who didn't know the old story, proving herself through work. She looked at Emma's portfolio the first time they met and said, with the directness of someone who didn't deal in comfort flattery, "These are genuinely excellent. I have 2 clients who need exactly this. Can you start next month?" Emma said yes before she'd finished processing the question. It was a strange sensation, that yes. She'd said it the way she used to say yes to things before Marcus. The instinctive forward lean of someone who recognizes an opportunity and reaches for it before the cautious part of her brain can construct an argument against. She'd spent 14 months slowly losing that instinct, not in any single dramatic moment, but in the accumulated small erosions of a relationship that had needed her to be smaller, more deliberate, more focused on the future they were building together than on the work she was building for herself. And somewhere in those months, the instinct had quieted, and she hadn't noticed until it came back, sudden and unmistakable, on a couch in Tanya's apartment while she was still technically in the worst period of her life. That yes, before she'd finished processing, was the clearest signal she'd gotten that she was returning to herself. The first client Priya connected her with was a restaurant owner in Culver City who needed a renovation on a timeline that most contractors would have declined. Emma sat across from him at a corner table in his existing restaurant and spread her sketches across the table and walked him through her vision. How she could preserve the warmth of the current space while opening it up. How the right repositioning of the kitchen pass-through would change the entire energy of the dining room. How better fenestration on the south wall would let in afternoon light that would make the space feel completely different at the hours when it was currently half empty. The restaurant owner listened with his arms folded and his expression skeptical. And then he said, almost despite himself, "Okay, how soon can you start?" She started the following Monday. She worked on it from coffee shops and the corner of Tanya's dining room table, her laptop propped open, her sketches spread around her. The work was good. She could feel it while she was doing it, the specific sensation of someone working in their actual register, at the correct level of effort and attention, making something that matched the full size of what they were capable of. She hadn't felt that way in over a year. She hadn't realized how much she'd missed it until she was back inside it. There was Nicole, who'd created a nonprofit providing legal resources to survivors of financial abuse after navigating that system herself and finding it nearly inaccessible. She introduced Emma to a pro bono legal collective that supplemented Lisa's work. Additional eyes on the case, additional pressure in the right places. These women didn't offer sympathy, or rather, they offered sympathy in the efficient way of people who had long since recognized that sympathy alone was a holding pattern. They offered practical help, connections, knowledge that had been hard-won and was being passed forward. Emma found herself, within 6 weeks of sitting in Lisa's office, part of a network that was actually helping her rebuild. Not emotionally, not philosophically, but concretely, materially, in the specific practical ways that mattered. The work started slowly. The restaurant redesign in Culver City came through Priya's connection. A small renovation, nothing glamorous, but it was hers, and she did it well, and the owner posted about it on social media with specificity that led to 2 more inquiries. The boutique hotel renovation in Santa Monica came from one of those, and that project was substantial enough to list as a real credit. Emma worked from coffee shops and libraries, her laptop on her knees, buying coffee she sometimes couldn't really afford, so she could sit for 3 hours in a space that had good light and the ambient hum of other people working. She discovered that she worked better this way than she had in the West Hollywood apartment, which had been beautiful and expensive and somehow always felt slightly like someone else's space. This was hers. Unbeautiful, provisional, honest. It was hers. 3 months after moving to Tanya's couch, Emma had 6 clients, a small but growing reputation in the community design space, and a level of focus she hadn't felt in over a year. She wasn't thinking about her shared future anymore. She was thinking about her actual work, her actual vision, the building she actually wanted to make. And those thoughts felt like sparks rather than obligations. Meanwhile, on the other side of the frozen account, Marcus was running out of runway. Emma learned about it in pieces, through Lisa, through Sergeant Alvarez, through the occasional update that filtered through the legal process. He'd tried to access lines of credit and been denied because of the pending fraud investigation hanging over his name. He'd tried to lease a new apartment in Silver Lake and been rejected. His professional network was thin because it was constructed. Contacts who'd believed in Marcus Chen, financial consultant, who were quietly backing away from an identity that was starting to smell like what it actually was. He'd had the money, but he couldn't spend it freely because the court had frozen the account. He'd had the apartment, but Emma wasn't there to perform the function he'd put her there to perform. He'd had the whole scaffolding of a stolen life, and with Emma gone and the legal system engaged, the scaffolding was rattling. She didn't feel satisfaction about this in those months. She felt too busy, too focused, too genuinely absorbed in her own rebuilding to spend much energy on his unraveling. But she knew it was happening. And there was something quietly just about that. Not revenge, which requires attention and investment, but simple consequence. The natural outcome of actions catching up with the person who took them. She thought occasionally about the specific cruelty of the design. He hadn't stolen from her the way someone breaks a window and grabs what they can carry. He'd spent 14 months carefully, patiently building something she believed in, building the emotional infrastructure of a shared life, a future, an us, so that by the time he moved the money, she wouldn't be a stranger he'd robbed, but a woman handing him everything she had, with love, of her own free will. That distinction mattered to him, she understood now. It wasn't just more efficient, it was the point. The performance of love as a mechanism of theft requires that the target truly feel the love. She had. She'd felt every bit of it. And he'd known she would, because he'd selected her specifically for her capacity to feel things fully and trust completely. The sophistication of it, the patience, the precision, the long-game calculation, was almost impossible to hold in her mind without her thoughts sliding away from it. People didn't think of emotional manipulation at that scale as a crime with a victim. But she was the victim. She had the empty bank account and the fog of 6 days on a couch to prove it. She had the memory of standing in a bathroom at 4 a.m. with her knuckles white against the porcelain, watching the number where her grandmother's life savings had been. 8 months after the 4 a.m. call, Emma moved into a small, shared office space in Venice with 2 other designers, a product designer named Chris and a graphic designer named Maya. They split the rent 3 ways and shared the printer and the good conference table and the irregular energy of a space full of people doing work they cared about. Emma painted one wall of her corner with chalkboard paint and covered it with design sketches and project timelines, and in the top corner, a quote from one of her architecture professors that she'd forgotten she'd loved. The building is not the architect's statement. It is the community's home. She'd found the Venice office through Maya, who was a friend of Priya's, which was how the whole network worked. A chain of people who'd needed help, and then become help, each link forged in the specific gratitude of someone who'd been handed something real when they needed it and couldn't forget how that felt. The space was on the 2nd floor of a converted warehouse 2 blocks from the canals, and it had the raw, provisional feeling of places where actual work happened. Exposed beams, mismatched chairs, a coffee maker that required a specific technique involving a pencil to get the hot plate working. Emma had walked in the first morning with her laptop bag over one shoulder and her design notebooks under her arm, looked at the chalkboard wall and the good north-facing light, and felt, for the first time since she'd packed those 2 suitcases in the dark, that she was in the right room. Not the right room in the sense of comfort or beauty. The office was neither particularly comfortable nor particularly beautiful, but the right room in the sense that it was built for exactly the kind of work she was trying to do, and the people in it were exactly the kind of people she needed to be near. Absorbed in their own projects, capable of independent focus, available for the particular kind of encouragement that professional peers offer each other, which is less about cheerleading and more about the mutual recognition of craft. Chris had looked at her portfolio the first week and said simply, "The way you handle light is remarkable." Maya had said nothing about the portfolio at all and had instead, 6 days later, forwarded her a contact for a community design grant with the message, "This is exactly what you do. Apply." Both responses were exactly right. She was happy. She was genuinely happy, in the way that's different from the contentment she'd mistaken for happiness when she was with Marcus, which had been the feeling of things fitting together, of a plan proceeding on schedule. This was something rawer and more certain. The feeling of doing exactly what she was made to do, with exactly the people who saw it clearly. She had 17 clients by the time the call came. 17 clients, a waiting list, and a project that had kept her up at night for 3 months. A community center in Echo Park, her largest project yet, for a neighborhood she'd loved since she first moved to Los Angeles. The commission had come through the nonprofit network Nicole had introduced her to. It was real, it was substantial, and it was everything she'd ever wanted to design. The call from Lisa came on a Wednesday afternoon in late October, 11 months after her sister's 4 a.m. phone call had split her world in 2. "He wants to meet," Lisa said. "He's offering to settle. Full restitution of the funds in exchange for you dropping the criminal case. His attorney reached out this morning. They're presenting it as an offer, but I think we both know what it is." "What is it?" Emma asked. "It's a man who's run out of options. His credit is destroyed, his identity is compromised, the fraud investigation is expanding. Sergeant Alvarez told me they have 2 other leads from other jurisdictions. He's looking at a trial he's going to lose and a sentence he can't afford. He wants to buy his way out of the worst of it." Emma thought about it for exactly 10 seconds. Set it up. His attorney's office? My office, Lisa said firmly. Your terms. My attorney's office, Emma said. I choose when. The meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. on a Friday in late October. The Los Angeles afternoon light through the windows of Century City would be that particular gold of late autumn. Emma arrived early. She'd thought carefully about what she wore, the charcoal blazer she'd bought for her first official client presentation as a solo firm, the one she'd worn when she'd walked into a meeting with the Echo Park Neighborhood Association and sold them on her vision. She carried her leather portfolio with the latest project drawings inside. Not because she planned to show anyone, but because it was the clearest external sign of who she was now, who she'd become in the months since she'd left the West Hollywood apartment with 2 suitcases and nothing resembling a plan. Lisa was already there, her desk clear, her reading glasses on, her expression the focused neutrality of someone who'd done this before and knew exactly how it was going to go. She looked at Emma when she came in and said simply, "You ready?" Emma thought about what ready meant. 11 months ago, she'd been barely upright on Tanya's couch, unable to eat, running a loop of self-recrimination that had no exit. Now she was sitting in her attorney's office, 17 clients, a waiting list, the biggest project of her career on the boards, and a clarity about herself that hadn't existed before all of this happened. Ready wasn't the right word. Arrived was more accurate. "Yes," she said. Marcus arrived at 2:07 p.m. with his attorney, a man named Barrett, who had the polished manner of someone who negotiated exits for a living. But Emma's eyes went past Barrett immediately, pulled to Marcus with the gravity that comes from having known someone's face as intimately as she'd known his. He looked smaller than she remembered. That was the first thing. Not thinner exactly, though he was thinner, but smaller in some harder-to-articulate way, as though the space he'd occupied in her memory had been inflated by the story she'd told about him, and the actual person had never been that large. His eyes were shadowed. His skin had a grayish quality. He sat down across from her and looked at the table. He didn't meet her eyes, not at first. Emma sat very still across from him and noticed the specific quality of that stillness in herself. There was a time, not long ago, in the weeks immediately after the 4 a.m. call, when the sight of him would have fractured something in her. Even the anticipation of this meeting had carried, in the days leading up to it, a faint tremor of something that wasn't quite fear, but was adjacent to it. The residue of knowing someone so completely, of having trusted them with your face before you were ready, your voice before you thought about it, the thoughts you had at 2 a.m. He'd been inside her life in all the ways that matter, and that intimacy didn't simply vanish because it had been fraudulent. It became something else, a ghost of connection, present and empty simultaneously. She'd spent the days before the meeting consciously doing what she always did now when the past intruded. She turned toward the work. She looked at the Echo Park blueprints. She let the specificity of design pull her back into herself. And now, sitting across the table from him, she felt none of the tremor she'd feared. She felt clear. Lisa laid out the terms with the clean efficiency of someone who'd prepared this thoroughly. Full restitution of $338, $920, transferred via certified wire within 48 hours of agreement. Marcus would sign a written acknowledgement of fraud, not a full criminal confession, but a document that served as an admission. Emma would agree not to pursue additional civil claims beyond what the criminal investigation chose to prosecute independently. The state had its own case running and would proceed regardless of this settlement. Barrett began negotiating immediately. Could they discuss the acknowledgement language? Could they look at a payment schedule rather than full transfer? Could they consider— "These are the terms," Lisa said. Her voice had the texture of something load-bearing. "There is no payment schedule. There is no language negotiation. Accept them or we proceed to trial, and your client faces 10 years for identity fraud, theft, and financial abuse. And my client has documented every cent and every signature." Barrett looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at his hands, and then, Because the silence had stretched past the point where it felt like leverage and into the territory where it simply felt like defeat, Marcus looked up. He looked at Emma directly for the first time since he'd walked into the room. And Emma saw, with the precision of someone who had once known his face as well as her own, exactly what was happening behind his eyes, the recognition that he had lost. Not just the case, the game, the whole architecture of control and manipulation that he'd constructed, the careful selection of her as a target, the 14 months of patient, precise relationship building designed to give him access to everything she had. He'd positioned himself perfectly, he'd executed it nearly flawlessly, and she was still here, and he had nothing. "You were supposed to be easy," he said. His voice was quiet, bitter, the sound of someone who can't stop the words from coming, even knowing they shouldn't. "You were supposed to be trusting?" Emma said. Her voice was calm. It was steady. It was cold in the way of something very clear and very certain, not in the way of anger or contempt. She looked at him with the particular clarity of someone who has spent 11 months understanding exactly what happened and is no longer afraid of any part of it. "I was," she said, "and you were supposed to be human." The silence that followed those words had a specific quality. Barrett stopped mid-preparation for whatever he'd been about to say. Lisa sat very still. Marcus flinched, a small movement, barely visible, but Emma was watching for it, and she saw it. And then he looked away. He looked at the table. His jaw worked once, tightening, and then the fight that had briefly animated his expression went out. He looked at Barrett. "Give me the pen," he said. He signed the settlement. He signed the acknowledgement. He signed every page that was set in front of him without further comment, without negotiation, without looking at Emma again. Barrett made one more attempt, a small verbal objection to the acknowledgement language, and Lisa simply waited with the patience of someone who knew exactly how much time she had and exactly how little he did. Barrett subsided. It took 11 minutes. When Marcus and his attorney left, Emma and Lisa sat in the quiet of the office for a moment. Emma looked at the signed documents on the table between them. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't crying. She felt the same clean, cold steadiness she'd felt in the moment she'd said those words. The feeling of something balanced precisely and correctly, of weight distributed exactly right. "Well," Lisa said, and smiled for the first time. "That's done." 48 hours later, Emma's phone showed a bank notification. Business account. She opened the app and looked at the number, $338,920, all of it. Every cent that had been transferred out while she slept. Every cent she'd spent 11 months separated from. Every cent her grandmother had worked 40 years to save and entrusted to her granddaughter's future. She stared at it for a long time. She waited to feel triumphant. What she felt instead was quieter and more permanent. A certainty. This was hers. It had always been hers. And now she had something she hadn't had the first time she'd held this money. The knowledge, tested and proven, of exactly what she was capable of when everything was taken away. She didn't need the inheritance to start her firm anymore. She'd already started. She had 17 clients, a waiting list, an office in Venice, a network of people who genuinely supported her work. She'd built all of that from a couch in Koreatown with 2 suitcases and nothing else. The money was just what came after. The money was what made growing easier, faster, more secure. But it wasn't the foundation. She was the foundation. She called Rachel first, before she called Tanya, before she called Lisa to confirm, before she sat down and let the full weight of it settle over her. Rachel first, because Rachel had been carrying this alongside her every day for 11 months, calling every morning with the faithful consistency of someone who has decided that showing up is not optional. Rachel, who had made the 4 a.m. call that started all of this, who had almost not made it, who had stared at her phone in the dark of her Pasadena bedroom and almost convinced herself that she'd imagined the resemblance, that she was being paranoid, that the cost of being wrong was too high. Emma had learned this detail only months later, and it had stayed with her. The fact that the thing that changed everything had almost not happened. That the 4 a.m. call had required from Rachel a specific kind of courage. The courage of someone who decides that loving a person is more important than the fear of being wrong about it. Her sister picked up on the second ring and started crying before Emma had finished saying, "It's done." She cried the kind of tears that are relief and gratitude and the release of 11 months of worry carried in the background of every single day, and Emma found her own eyes burning in response to the sound of that love. "You did it," Rachel kept saying. "Em, you actually did it." "You did it first," Emma said. "You made the call." The 4 a.m. call, the shaking voice, the article that Rachel had almost not sent because she was scared she was wrong, scared of what it would do to her sister's life. Emma thought about how close Rachel had come to waiting, to deciding it was a bad idea, to convincing herself she'd misremembered the face in the photograph. She thought about what her life would look like now if that call had never come. If Marcus had continued undisturbed, if she'd kept handing him money and trust and time until he decided she'd been fully used. Rachel had saved her. Not from a man, exactly. Emma understood by now that she would have survived Marcus eventually, that the money would have run out, or his attention would have moved on, and the whole construction would have collapsed. But Rachel had saved her from months or years more of the slow, steady dimming, had given her back to herself earlier. "I love you," Emma said. "I owe you everything." "You don't owe me anything," Rachel said. "Just be the bright version, okay? Stay bright." The dinner with her parents came next. Her mother had called 3 days after the settlement cleared, tentative and warm, and clearly rehearsing some form of apology in the spaces between words. Emma had been guarded at first, not because she blamed her parents, but because the whole process of Marcus had involved a specific diminishing of her own instincts in favor of his presentation. And she'd spent 11 months rebuilding those instincts carefully, and she didn't want to compromise them again by performing okay for people who needed her to be okay. But her parents weren't asking her to perform. They were asking her to come to dinner. And so she went. A trattoria in Los Feliz, a neighborhood restaurant with small tables and red-checked tablecloths and the warm noise of a Friday evening, the kind of place where conversations can be quiet and still feel private. Her father asked about her projects with genuine curiosity, leaning forward in the way he did when he was actually listening. And Emma found herself describing the Echo Park Community Center in more detail than she'd expected to, using her hands, sketching a sightline on the paper tablecloth with a pen she found in her pocket. Her mother asked if she was okay, really okay, with the directness that was distinctly her mother's, the particular refusal to accept a surface answer that Emma had found maddening as a teenager and was now profoundly grateful for. "Yeah," Emma said. "I am. Better than okay, actually." Her mother reached across the table and took her hand, just held it. Emma looked down at her mother's hand over hers and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. The specific comfort of being someone's child, of being known by someone who had watched you become yourself. "I'm sorry I disappeared for a while," Emma said quietly. "I know I changed when I was with him. I know I pulled away." "You came back," her mother said. "That's what matters." Not everyone had. Some friendships had thinned and faded during the worst months, people who'd found the mess too uncomfortable, the story too heavy, the work of staying too much. There was a woman she'd known for 3 years, a colleague, someone she'd considered a genuine friend, who had called once in the first week and then gone quiet, and Emma had understood, without being told, that the size of what had happened to her had exceeded what that friendship could hold. That understanding hurt, but it didn't surprise her. Some containers are only built for good weather. Emma had grieved those losses and then let them go. The people who mattered, Rachel, Tanya, and now her parents finding their way back, had survived. And Emma had come to understand something about that. The people who stay during the fire are showing you something true about themselves, something you can carry forward. You don't need everyone. You need the right ones. Marcus's sentencing came through on a Wednesday evening in December. Emma was in her Venice office, reviewing the final blueprints for the Echo Park Community Center, when Lisa's message arrived. She read it once, then again. Michael Brennan, sentenced to 3 years for identity fraud and financial abuse, plus restitution orders for 2 additional victims who had come forward after Emma's case went public. The legal proceedings had surfaced a pattern. 2 other women in other cities, other variations of the same method. The same careful targeting of capable women with resources and trust and everything they'd worked for. Those women had not come forward before Emma. But once Emma's case became public record, they had. Her fight had made their fight possible. Emma set the phone down and sat with that for a moment. 3 years. He wouldn't be doing this again soon. And the victims who'd come after her, or perhaps before her in other cities, had gotten their own measures of justice through the same legal process she'd set in motion. She hadn't done this for them. She'd done it for herself, for the $338, $920, for the grandmother who'd worked 40 years to give her that inheritance, for the 17 clients who trusted her work, for the woman on Tanya's couch who'd needed someone to tell her she had rights. But somehow, by fighting for herself, she'd created something larger, a record, a precedent, a door that other people had been able to walk through. She picked the phone up and texted Lisa, "Thank you for all of it." Lisa's reply came 4 minutes later. "It was a privilege. Now go build something." Emma set the phone face down on the desk, looked at the blueprints, and did exactly that. Then she turned back to the blueprints. 2 years after the 4 a.m. call, Emma stood in the completed Echo Park Community Center on the afternoon of its opening. It was everything she'd hoped it would be. Not perfectly, because buildings are never exactly what you draw, but in the essential way, the way that mattered, the light was right. She'd spent months on the fenestration, on the angle of the windows, and the quality of what would come through them at different times of day. In the late afternoon, the main hall filled with a particular warm gold that made everyone who walked in pause, just slightly, because their eyes told them they'd arrived somewhere worth being. She stood near the entrance and watched people discover the space. An elderly man in a guayabera shirt stepped through the front door and stopped, turning slowly, taking in the height of the ceiling and the way the light came through the western windows in long angled bars that crossed the floor like something drawn deliberately. His face did the thing Emma had spent her career working toward. It softened. He exhaled. He let himself be held by the room. An older woman from the neighborhood association, who had fought alongside Emma through 3 rounds of permit revisions, pressed her hands together when she walked in and looked at Emma with an expression that needed no words. A group of teenagers from the community programs that would use this building drifted in and immediately dispersed to every corner, finding the best window seats, claiming territory, doing exactly what people do in spaces that feel like they belong to them. That was right. That was exactly right. The room was full. The neighborhood association members who'd believed in her vision and fought the permits alongside her. Chris and Maya from the Venice office, who'd covered her other projects during the final push of this one. Priya and Jenna and Nicole, her network, the women who'd helped her rebuild and had watched the rebuild become something they could point to. Rachel, who'd driven down from Pasadena and kept reaching over to squeeze Emma's arm at intervals, as though she needed the tactile proof that this was real. Her parents, her father looking at the building the way her father had always looked at things she made, with a quiet, solid pride that didn't need words. Tanya found her near the long windows facing west, the ones Emma had argued hardest for, the ones the original architects thought were impractical. Through them, the city stretched out, the specific sprawling, improbable, impossible Los Angeles that Emma had chosen and been chosen by, that had given her the 4 a.m. call and Tanya's couch and Lisa Okonkwo and 17 clients and this room full of light. "You did this," Tanya said, standing beside her. You know that, right? This is yours." Emma nodded. She did know. She'd known it since she'd spread design prints across a living room floor in Koreatown at midnight, since she'd sketched on a paper tablecloth in Los Feliz while explaining sightlines to her father, since she'd stood in this building a month ago during the final walkthrough and felt the afternoon light arrive exactly where she'd calculated it would, and known, with the bone-deep certainty of work done right, that she'd gotten something true. She thought about her grandmother, who'd worked 40 years and spent nothing on herself and trusted Emma with everything she'd saved. She thought about what her grandmother would see standing in this room: the light, the clean lines, the space designed to welcome people who needed it. She thought about whether this was what the inheritance had been for, not the failed plan with Marcus that it had almost funded, but this room, this moment. Maybe the inheritance had worked exactly as it was supposed to, just not in any way that Emma had predicted or controlled. It had revealed who she could trust. It had forced her to find herself. It had given her, through the process of its loss and recovery, a version of herself that she'd never have arrived at along the path she'd been walking before the 4 a.m. call. Marcus had tried to erase her, to extract the resources and discard the person, to install someone else in the scaffolding of her life until there was nothing left that was recognizably Emma. He'd wanted to make her disappear. Instead, she'd made him irrelevant. Not through revenge, not through performance, but through the simple, radical act of building something so thoroughly hers that there was no room in it for the story of him. She was standing in the proof. The late afternoon light came through the long western windows and lay gold across the floor of the room Emma had designed, in the city she'd chosen, among the people who'd stayed. And she felt, with the quiet permanence of something that couldn't be taken away, exactly like herself. There is a thing that nobody tells you about being targeted by someone like Marcus. They tell you to be careful, to watch for red flags, to trust your gut. What they don't tell you is that the most sophisticated predators are specifically skilled at neutralizing those defenses, not through force or deception alone, but through patience, through building genuine emotional trust over time, through carefully identifying and mirroring exactly what their target needs to feel seen and valued. Studies on romantic fraud consistently show that victims are not characterized by naivety or low intelligence. They are characterized by the capacity for deep trust and emotional investment, qualities that are not weaknesses in any healthy relationship. They become vulnerabilities only when encountered by someone who has specifically learned to exploit them. What Emma's story demonstrates is that the path through a catastrophic betrayal of trust is not to become someone who trusts less. It is to become someone who knows themselves better, who understands the difference between love that asks you to grow and manipulation that asks you to shrink, between someone who celebrates your light and someone who needs to dim it to sustain the performance they're running. The researcher Brené Brown has written that the prerequisite for genuine connection is the willingness to be seen, and that the armor we build after being hurt, the distrust, the self-protection, the decision to need no one, costs us the very connection we're trying to protect. Emma didn't armor herself, she rebuilt. And the life she built was larger, more connected, more genuinely hers than the one that had been taken. There is something else worth naming: the people who stay. Rachel, calling at 4:17 a.m. because she couldn't not. Tanya, who already had the door unlocked. Lisa, who said you won't be fighting alone. Priya and Jenna and Nicole, who showed up with their own hard-won knowledge and handed it forward. The people who stayed are not a footnote to Emma's story. They are the architecture of it. None of us rebuild alone. We rebuild in the company of the right people who appear, sometimes at 4 a.m., sometimes on the 7th day when you've stopped being able to help yourself, and hold the thing steady while we find our footing. If this story found you at your own version of 4 a.m., this is what I want you to hear. You have rights. You have people. And you are more than what was taken. If this story moved you, if Emma's fight meant something to you, please take 2 seconds and hit the like button. It costs nothing, and it helps this channel reach people who might really need to hear this. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. We tell stories here that are worth staying for. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there. I genuinely want to know. I read them. And the video up next, I really want you to see it. It is the story of a woman who spent 12 years building a company, only to find out on the day of her retirement party that everything had been quietly transferred to someone who was never supposed to have it. What she found when she started pulling that thread, and what she did with what she found, is going to stay with you. Don't let it play without you. I'll see you there.